Hi, I'm Ken Howard, and welcome to the Gay Therapy LA podcast. Today, I want to talk about when a gay man's career feels one accusation away from collapse: false accusations, workplace anxiety, and what to do. For over 30 years, I've worked almost exclusively with gay men as a psychotherapist and a sex-certified sex therapist, as well as a life, career, and executive coach. Over time, I've helped gay male clients navigate not only relationships and identity and various kinds of personal problems, but also high-stakes professional situations where reputation, authority, and livelihood are on the line. In recent years, I've seen a specific kind of crisis emerge more frequently. Several guys I've worked with, actually. One that does not arise from failure, but from sudden and often confusing experience of being questioned, misinterpreted, or formally challenged in ways that feel disproportionate to what actually occurred. Many of the men I work with are accomplished, thoughtful, and deeply invested in doing their work well. These are high-level, very skilled, admirable professionals. And they're experienced, and they're conscientious and self-aware, and accustomed to functioning at a complex level in all different kinds of environments. And yet, this is precisely where the problem can arise. This is not about obvious misconduct or long-standing patterns of inappropriate behavior. In many cases, it involves men who have a strong history of professionalism, respect for others, and sensitivity to diversity in the workplace that's been demonstrated over time, and who are often surprised to find themselves in situations that escalate in ways that they did not anticipate. What makes this experience so destabilizing emotionally is not simply what happens, but also how quickly it changes form. A situation that begins as a routine workplace interaction, a comment, a correction, a performance evaluation, or a moment of accountability can suddenly shift into something else entirely. The tone changes, the language becomes more formal. There are references to concerns, impact, or bias. What had been an interpersonal issue becomes documented, and what had been manageable may now involve management oversight or review or internal escalation. And once that happens, the situation changes completely. Because now it is no longer just about what happened, it's about how it is interpreted by you and by others, how it is documented, requiring accuracy, clarity, and access, and how it is processed within an institutional system, a school, a company, a corporation, a nonprofit, where fairness, procedure, and judgment all come into play. For many professionals, this is the moment where anxiety begins to accelerate. At that moment, the experience changes internally as well, where the question is no longer, did I handle that correctly? It becomes, am I at risk? And how serious is this? For men who have spent decades building a professional identity based on fairness, responsibility, and competence, that shift can feel abrupt and deeply unsettling. Not because they're fragile, but because they understand often very clearly what is at stake. When professional situation starts to feel like exposure, let's look at that. Once a situation crosses into formal territory, a formal complaint where a supervisor, executive, human resources representative, or even law involvement might become a factor, the psychological experience is no longer about the content of the disagreement alone. It becomes about interpretation and documentation and process. And those three elements introduce something that is inherently destabilizing: loss of control over the narrative. So you may find yourself asking, what if this is interpreted in a way that I did not intend? What if this becomes a formal complaint or investigation? What if this is framed as discrimination, even if that was never my intention? What if I lose control of how this is described or recorded or remembered? What if this affects my reputation or my position or my future opportunities? These are not exaggerated concerns. They are grounded in an understanding that institutional processes, once activated, can take on a life of their own. And this is often the point at which anxiety accelerates, not as a generalized worry, but as a focused, high-stakes response to perceived professional threat that is sprung from some unexpected source due to some unintentional act. Let's look at how this is two real problems, not one. We have to be clear about something that is often avoided in public discussion but comes up directly in the therapy room. There are two real problems. The first is real historical and ongoing bias. Sexism, for example. The harms of gender-based discrimination, devaluation, bias, and harassment based on gender, overwhelmingly men against women, but occasionally women against men, which can happen. I personally experienced this as the only male in an all-female office at a nonprofit organization. So it can happen the other way. Sexism against trans people happens as well, whether trans feminine, trans masculine, or non-binary. There's a long and terrible history in the United States alone of atrocities against women in the workplace, especially with no accountability of the perpetrators, no legitimate investigation, and no accountability for the harms done, from hiring, firing, promotions, staffing, pay equity, or even harassment and assault. So get racism. The harms of race-based discrimination are countless in American society history. And the bias continues, such as the current Trump administration making formal executive orders and other directive, formal, far-reaching governmental commandments to unequivocally end diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in favor of its implied converse of homogeneity, inequity, and exclusion. The ills of the workplace of the past made new again in the current political and social climate, not so subtly implying an antiquated return to cisgender, straight, white, male, privileged, conservative Christian, rich men being in and everyone else out. That's the message of the anti-DEI movement in the administration. Look at homophobia, of course. The harms of discrimination based on sexual orientation, where, despite gains made in recent decades, current American legislation has been proposed, and in some cases passed, to strip LGBT people of their protections against discrimination in the workplace that were already on the books, de facto allowing and in some cases virulently encouraging harassment, discrimination, and abuse for LGBT people in the workplace endorsed by formal governmental bodies. I think that was the case from Arlington, Texas recently. Inequity in opportunity and treatment based not on skills, talents, and qualifications or experience or credentials, but based on irrelevant traits of the worker. These are not theoretical. They've caused real harm, and efforts to address them through workplace policies, reporting systems, laws, DEI efforts, and cultural change are necessary. But the second problem is what happens when those mechanisms are experienced as unpredictable, overcorrecting, or vulnerable to misuse. My clients will sometimes describe situations in which complaints are made in crass retaliation for being held to basic accountability. Legitimate performance feedback is reframed as illegitimate bias. Enforcement of standards of the profession for health, safety, and effectiveness becomes a risk for retaliatory complaints. Even raising this possibility can feel dangerous in itself because it's often interpreted as dismissing legitimate claims. But in practice, both realities can exist at the same time. And for the individual caught in the middle, that distinction matters enormously. Let's talk about when accountability gets reframed and the ground shifts. One of the most disorienting aspects of these situations is when something that has always been part of one's role, evaluating performance, enforcing standards, complying with laws, ethics, or regulations, grading coursework, assigning and evaluating work, giving performance feedback in the workplace, is suddenly reinterpreted as something else. A performance issue becomes a bias issue. A correction becomes a personal affront. A standard becomes unfair or targeting. A course grade becomes selective abuse. A standard of the profession becomes a personal grievance. From your perspective, you're doing what you've always done in the way that it has always been done. From the other person's perspective, or at least from how the situation is being reported or presented or claimed, something harmful has occurred. And that discrepancy is not merely frustrating, it's destabilizing. Because now you are no longer just in the role of evaluator or supervisor or teacher or professor. You are potentially in the role of the accused. Let's talk about the fear of it being used as weaponization or extortion. What intensifies the anxiety is the perception, again, sometimes accurate, sometimes not, that complaint systems can be used as leverage. In academic settings, this may involve concern that grading or evaluation will lead to accusations of bias. In workplace settings, it may involve performance reviews or promotions or supervisory decisions. At its most extreme, this begins to feel coercive and professionally threatening. If you don't give me what I want, I can make this a problem for you. Whether or not that is the intention in any given case, the experience of it is destabilizing. And the psychological response is predictable. Vigilance, anxiety, and a narrowing of behavior towards self-protection, a retreat into safety like a turtle retreating into its shell. And that is a very specific psychological experience that I've worked with guys on. It carries elements of threat, loss of control, and perceived leverage. And this can be the flight or fight or freeze or fawn experience that I've written about before. And for many men, it triggers something else very powerful, rage. Let's talk about the role of rage on both sides. Rage is not often discussed openly in these situations, and yet it's almost always present. There is the rage of the person who feels unfairly accused, who knows that their intentions, their history, their integrity, and experiences the accusation as a distortion or an attack. There also might be rage on the other side, the person who feels wronged, dismissed, or devalued, or treated unfairly, and whose response escalates accordingly. When rage enters the system, the situation becomes more volatile. It's like a bloodbath divorce. Because rage does not simply express itself, it drives action. It fuels retaliation, defensiveness, and escalation. It narrows perspective and increases the likelihood of decisions that may feel justified in the moment, but carry consequences later. One of the most important aspects of managing these situations is not eliminating anger, but containing it enough that it does not determine your behavior. Let's talk about generational and cultural fault lines in the workplace. Another layer that frequently complicates these dynamics is the intersection of generational differences. Many baby boomers and Gen X professionals were trained in environments where hierarchy, authority, and direct feedback were standard. Evaluation was expected. Criticism, when warranted, was considered part of professional development, even mentoring. The underlying assumption was that performance could and should be assessed, where poor performance was met with progressive discipline, such as verbal warnings, written warnings, plans of corrective action, probationary work, demotion, or dismissal, termination. And good performance was rewarded with praise, expansion of influence, promotions, or raises. In contrast, many millennials and Gen Z individuals have been socialized in environments historically that place greater emphasis on psychological safety, subjective experience, or sensitivity to power dynamics, patriarchy, or some kind of abuse of power and privilege. And there's often a lower tolerance for hierarchical authority and a heightened awareness of perceived inequity or bias. At their best, these shifts represent meaningful cultural progress, greater attention to fairness, inclusion, and the impact of power, addressing, finally, the vile social ills of sexism, racism, xenophobia, ableism, nepotism, religious discrimination, homophobia, gender oppression, or any difference in treatment in the workplace due to traits not germane to the performance of the job. But at their most challenging, these shifts can create ambiguity about whether any form of evaluation or correction will be experienced as legitimate. Different generations are operating with different assumption about what constitutes fairness or authority or appropriate feedback. Let's talk about the psychological impact: acute stress, intrusive thinking, and retaliation urges. The psychological response is similar in all three cases because the mind is not only reacting to the content of the accusation, it is reacting to the power of what the accusation can do: damage a reputation, trigger investigations, alter a career trajectory, create permanent records, inflict humiliation, invite suspicion, cause loss of livelihood and personal financial hardship, reputational ruin, relationship ruptures, loss of access to employer-sponsored medical care for that person or their spouse or partner or family, financial cost of litigation, isolation, a fear of impulsive acts, induce substance abuse relapse, cause sexual dysfunction, and exacerbate health conditions. The modern vernacular would be cancel culture, where that person doesn't just experience an incident to be adjudicated, but fears severe and potentially lasting professional damage, deserved or not, impacting any further ability to be known professionally or even have a livelihood in the same field. All with little or no time or opportunity to explain, clarify, validate, elucidate, litigate, or negotiate. In that sense, the panic is not irrational. It is a response to perceived risk, sometimes realistic, sometimes amplified, but almost always powerful. This is consistent with what I've written about in previous articles about anxiety and affect regulation in gay men, particularly when identity and livelihood are intertwined, as well as what I've written and talked about before about trauma and its recovery. By the time gay male professionals come to my virtual office online with these situations, they are rarely calm. What they are experiencing often resembles acute stress. Symptoms such as intrusive, repetitive thoughts dominate their attention. Conversations are replayed in their minds. Sleep becomes disrupted or interrupted with nightmares. The body remains in a state of heightened tension, cortisol and adrenaline and all of those neurobiological phenomena. Relationships are strained with a partner or spouse or children or other co-workers. Somatic symptoms like eye twitch, gastrointestinal distress, rashes, appetite changes, or muscle cramps might be present. Affect or mood might become unpredictable or dysregulated or impulsive. A general anxiety or even a paranoia that person never had might be present. Rumination on the situation is very common. There's often a strong pull toward action and an equally strong fear of making things worse. A sense of helplessness of damned if you do and damned if you don't. And this creates a bind. Act and you risk escalation. Do nothing and you feel exposed. For the individual trying to function within that environment, the cost is not theoretical. Let's talk about these psychological costs. So these costs show up as chronic anxiety, even in situations not related to work, like driving, socializing, sex, partner discussions, possibly parenting skills disruptions. Second-guessing decisions about seemingly everything in the workplace or even at home, a loss of confidence and self-assuredness and self-agency and self-esteem. Fear of unintended consequences and an exaggerated fear of bad outcomes on seemingly routine tasks, becoming hyper-aware. Difficulty trusting one's own judgment about anything anymore, and questioning a perception of reality. Research on workplace bullying and adversarial environments support this. Nielsen and Einerson in 2012 found that perceived exposure to negative acts in the workplace is strongly associated with anxiety and psychological distress, regardless of formal power dynamics. Your adversary in these situations could be above you or below you or beside you in an organizational chart. When individuals feel that they can be scrutinized or challenged in unpredictable ways, the nervous system responds accordingly, with the vigilance that attacks could come from any direction at any time. So let's talk about what actually helps and what doesn't. What does not help my clients in these situations is minimizing the risk, my offering blanket reassurance, oh, it'll be fine, or pretending that the system is always fair and predictable. It's not. That's part of the problem, is that systems don't always work the way they should or even the way they purport to work. Their own system becomes contaminated and doesn't work the way they state that it works. And my clients are too intelligent and too perceptive for all of that. What does help is stabilizing the emotional response so clear thinking becomes possible. Separating realistic risk from catastrophic projection. Identifying concrete options, including legal or institutional support when appropriate. And maintaining a clear sense of self in the middle of the process. In one recent case, at my client's request, I referred him to a very experienced employment attorney who's helped many of my clients over the years win six-figure settlements in cases that involve discrimination about sexual orientation, HIV status, or psychiatric disability. And we discussed the possibility of a medical short-term disability leave. Kind of wealthy states like California have benefits like that some other states don't have. But the tax base and what you pay into it allows in California for the state disability insurance program. Given the severity of his anxiety and insomnia, it was medically right to consider a short-term medical disability leave. So therapy in this context is not passive, abstract, or necessarily insight-oriented. It is practical. When therapy is especially practical, it can have a lot in common with coaching. So let's look at therapy and coaching, two lenses on the same problem. This is a good place to maybe distinguish between therapy and coaching yet again, because both can be relevant services in these kinds of situations, but they serve different functions. From a therapy's perspective, the focus is on internal emotional regulation and understanding. It's about identifying how current stress is activating earlier experiences of vulnerability, what we would call now triggers, in your family of origin. Recognizing when the present situation is being amplified by past trauma. Trauma tends to go in a line like a string of pearls in your life. Understanding your psychological defense mechanisms that are your usual go-to defense mechanisms. Identifying adaptive versus maladaptive coping strategies and evaluating them or prioritizing them. That's one of the key functions of therapy in this, is my helping you evaluate whether an action you're thinking of taking is adaptive or maladaptive, and prioritizing which order to take things. Reducing catastrophic thinking through cognitive reframing and decatastrophizing, staying within the realm of rational thinking. Managing the physiological aspects of anxiety, sleep disruption, hypervigilance, emotional reactivity, muscle tension, gastrointestinal system upset, eye twitches, or body aches. Working with anger, fear, and frustration so they can be felt without becoming overwhelming or impulsively expressed. In many cases, the current perpetrator or accuser is not just being reacted to as they are, but as an echo of earlier experiences in which the stakes felt similarly high or similarly unsafe. And that distinction matters because without it, the emotional intensity of the present situation can exceed what the current facts alone would justify. It's your system trying to protect you because it's saying, uh-oh, this is just like that previous situation. Or, uh-oh, this person who's a threat is exactly like so-and-so who was a threat in the past. Different situations, different people. But your defenses don't know that. They just know they want to jump to protect you. But in contrast to therapy, and from a coaching perspective, the focus shifts more toward external navigation. So that might be identifying available options, evaluating their usefulness, and their likely consequences. Evaluating risk realistically rather than catastrophically. Developing a plan of action, legal, professional, strategic, behavioral. Rallying appropriate resources, legal counsel, human resources consultation, medical leave with a doctor, documentation, witnesses, and standards, objective standard like an employee handbook or a student handbook, academic literature of the field that's peer-reviewed and published, local laws, or employment contracts. Strengthening skills in decision-making under pressure. Maintaining professional positioning while responding to the situation. You still have to go into work every day and function, unless you take the medical leave, right? Both lenses are valuable with me, with many years of experience in both service deliveries, therapy and coaching. In general, one stabilizes the internal system in therapy, while the other, coaching, organizes the external response. And in complex situations like this, elements of both are often needed. Let's look at there's a temptation to collapse or overcorrect. Clients in these situations often move toward one of two extremes: collapse, I'm in trouble, I can't handle this, to overcorrection. Okay, I'll just avoid all risk and stop holding anyone accountable for anything ever, and just phone in the work. Neither of those works because collapse undermines functioning and overcorrection undermines integrity and effectiveness of the mission, of the job, or of the organization, or of the field that you're working in. The goal is something more difficult but more sustainable, remaining steady enough to act with clarity in an environment that does not always feel clear. It can even feel chaotic. So, why this requires ongoing work? At the end of a recent session about this, my client expressed appreciation for the clarity he gained by the discussion in the session. But clarity is not the same as resolution. Situations like this fold over time, sometimes a long time. They require ongoing assessment and reassessment, ongoing emotional regulation and re-regulation with every new piece of information or stimulation that comes up. Thoughtful decision-making as new information emerges. I see that a lot. There's a new email, a new decision, a new question that the person has to respond to a lot with new email and sometimes a very long administrative or even a long legal process. And lots of patience with a usually cumbersome, bureaucratic, and often contradictory, maybe even hypocritical system. And this is consistent with what I've seen in my work with gay men navigating their career and other aspects of their identity. Stability is restored through an adaptive coping process, not a single conversation. So, if you recognize yourself in this, if you're dealing with a workplace situation, a fear of reputational harm, anxiety related to professional risk, and uncertainty about how to respond, it is important to recognize that your reaction is not a sign of weakness, but actually a sign that something significant is at stake, and that requires attention. The anxiety is a signal that who you are professionally and what you do and whom you do it for are all important in your professional and even your personal value system. These situations wouldn't be difficult if you weren't at least somewhat personally invested in your career and in your role, as I think we all should be. So a final thought on this is if this is happening to you. If you're dealing with a fear of false accusations or anxiety about HR or concern about your professional reputation, it's worth taking seriously. Guys can and do lose jobs, reputations, and careers over things that were actually either false accusations or greatly misinterpreted. Justice is not always served, and it takes a certain kind of response to contain the drama and the damage. It is a great injustice to be falsely or inaccurately accused or to violate one's rights, such as to free speech within legal limits or academic freedom. It's a great injustice to harass someone or to bear false witness or to threaten or to blackmail or coerce, just as much as it is a crime to commit forgery or burglary or assault. These are crimes. When an accusation enters the picture, everything can begin to feel unstable very quickly, not because you've changed and not because your abilities have diminished, but because the system you are operating within suddenly feels less predictable. The ground beneath you has shifted. The culture that you're maybe used to organizationally or institutionally has changed. The world has changed from what you were originally promised or led to believe. When that predictability is lost, anxiety takes its place. The work in therapy or coaching is not simply to reduce that anxiety, but to remain steady enough to think clearly, act appropriately, and protect what you have built. Possibly the most important element is reaching out for help. Anxiety thrives in isolation, and reaching out and connecting with another person brings it out into the light for examination and defusing the severity of it. You're always welcome to have a free 15-minute consultation via Zoom or phone to see if we're a good fit. Ken@gaytherapyla.com, Ken@gaycoachingla.com, or just text or call 310-339-5778. That's 310-339-5778. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.
This spring, David's Werner Los Angeles presents a solo exhibition of work by Joseph Albers. Shown in pairs, the work reflects Albers' lifelong study of duality, color, and form. Discover paintings that the New York Times says impart an otherworldly serenity in the artist's first solo exhibition in Los Angeles in over 40 years. To learn more, visit the gallery in Melrose Hill or go to davidswerner.com/Los Angeles.